In the autumn of 1993, in a quiet logging town in Oregon, a young woman went missing without warning. Authorities were left with nothing, and the mystery remained unsolved. More than 21 years later, one small detail reopened the case. It uncovered a truth no one was prepared for. Pine Ridge, Oregon was the kind of town where nothing ever really happened. It was a place surrounded by endless forests of tall, dark pines, where the air always smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. The population hovered right around 3,000 people. Everyone knew their neighbors. Everyone knew what car you drove, where you bought your groceries, and what pew you sat in on Sunday mornings. It was a peaceful, predictable community. People moved to Pine Ridge to live a quiet life, to raise their families away from the noise of the big city, and to eventually grow old on their front porches. It was not the kind of place where someone could just vanish off the face of the earth. Eleanor Vance was 26 years old. Most people in town just called her Ellie. She was born and raised in Pine Ridge, but unlike most kids who grew up there, she didn't stay. As soon as she graduated from high school, Ellie wanted to see the world. She wanted purpose and structure. So she packed a single duffel bag, hugged her younger sister goodbye, and joined the United States Army. Ellie served as a motor transport operator and a mechanic. She was deployed overseas during the Gulf War. For years, her only connection to Pine Ridge was the letters she sent home to her little sister, Sarah. The letters were always positive, filled with stories about the strange desert heat and the friends she was making. Ellie never wrote about the bad things. She was the older sister. Her job, in her own mind, was always to protect Sarah. In the winter of 1992, Ellie finally came home. The town welcomed her back with open arms. People stopped her in the grocery store to shake her hand and thank her for her service. But the Ellie who returned was slightly different from the teenager who had left. She was quieter now, more observant. When she walked into the local diner, she always sat in the corner booth, facing the door. She didn't like loud, sudden noises. She kept her hair cut short, just brushing the back of her neck, and she carried herself with a stiff, disciplined posture. Despite the subtle changes, Ellie settled back into civilian life quickly. She moved back into the small, single-story house she shared with Sarah on the edge of town. Their parents had passed away in a car accident when Sarah was still in middle school, leaving the house to both of them. For Sarah, having her big sister back was a dream come true. The house felt warm again. It felt safe. Ellie found a job almost immediately at Miller's Auto Repair, a busy garage located just off the main highway that ran through town. Because of her military experience working on heavy transport vehicles, Ellie could fix just about anything with an engine. She was a natural mechanic. Her boss, a gruff older man named Arthur Miller, quickly realized she was the hardest worker he had ever hired. She always showed up 15 minutes early. She never complained about the long hours. She didn't mind getting her hands covered in dark, heavy motor oil. For Ellie, engines made sense. They had rules. If something was broken, you just had to trace the problem back to the source, replace the part, and the machine would work again. It was a comforting, logical world. For the first 10 months after she returned, Ellie's life was simple and strictly routine. Every morning she woke up at 5:30. She made a pot of black coffee, went for a 3-mile run in the cold morning mist, and then came back to make breakfast for Sarah. Sarah was 19 at the time, attending community college a few towns over and working part-time at the local pharmacy. They would sit at the small kitchen table, eating toast and talking about their plans for the week. At exactly 7:30, Ellie would grab her keys, throw on her favorite faded brown leather jacket, and drive her 1988 Ford Ranger down to the auto shop. She worked until 6 in the evening, came home, ate dinner with Sarah, and read a book in the living room until she fell asleep. It was a good life. It was a normal life. Ellie seemed happy, grounded, and focused on building a future. She talked about saving enough money to buy the auto shop from Arthur when he eventually retired. She talked about helping Sarah pay off her student loans. She was deeply invested in tomorrow. She was not a woman who wanted to disappear. But looking back, Sarah would later realize that the routine started to crack about 3 weeks before October 14, 1993. It started with small things, tiny deviations from the strict schedule Ellie had built. One evening in late September, Sarah came home to find Ellie sitting on the front porch in the dark. The porch light was off. Ellie was just sitting on the wooden steps, staring out into the thick tree line across the street. She wasn't smoking. She wasn't drinking a beer. She was just watching the trees. When Sarah asked her what she was doing, Ellie jumped, startled. She quickly stood up, brushed off her jeans, and forced a smile. She said she was just getting some fresh air. But Sarah noticed that Ellie's hands were trembling slightly. And more importantly, Ellie immediately went inside and locked the heavy deadbolt behind them. A few days later, the phone calls started. Before this, the house phone rarely rang. When it did, it was usually a telemarketer or one of Sarah's friends from college. But suddenly, the phone would ring late at night, long after 9 o'clock. If Sarah moved to answer it, Ellie would rush into the kitchen and snatch the receiver off the wall before she could. "Hello," Ellie would say. Then silence. She would listen for a few seconds, her face turning pale and unreadable. She would whisper something too quietly for Sarah to hear and then hang up the phone. When Sarah asked who was calling, Ellie always gave the same excuse. Just a wrong number. But it didn't make sense. It just didn't. Wrong numbers didn't make your older sister grip the kitchen counter until her knuckles turned white. Wrong numbers didn't make a combat veteran look over her shoulder. Then came the second week of October. Sarah was studying in the living room when she heard the distinct sound of a power drill coming from the front door. She walked into the hallway to find Ellie installing a brand new, heavy-duty chain lock. She had already installed new deadbolts on the back door and the side door of the garage. "Ellie, what are you doing?" Sarah asked, feeling a cold knot form in her stomach. Ellie didn't look up from her work. She just kept driving the screws into the wooden frame. "Just taking precautions, kiddo," she said, her voice completely flat. "There have been some break-ins down in the valley. Better safe than sorry." Sarah didn't argue, but she knew her sister was lying. There hadn't been a break-in in Pine Ridge in over 4 years. Something was deeply wrong, really wrong. The safe, warm house suddenly felt like a fortress. Ellie was treating their home like a bunker. She started leaving for work a few minutes earlier each day, taking different routes to the auto shop instead of her usual straight drive down the main road. She stopped going for her morning runs. The faded brown leather jacket she always wore started to look less like a fashion choice and more like armor. Despite Sarah's growing anxiety, she didn't push the issue. She assumed Ellie was dealing with some delayed trauma from the war. People talked about PTSD all the time. Sarah figured her sister was just going through a rough patch, struggling with memories she didn't want to talk about. Sarah thought she was being respectful by giving her space. She would regret that silence for the rest of her life. Wednesday, October 13, 1993, was the last truly normal day they had together. It was raining. It was that heavy, relentless Pacific Northwest rain that turns the sky a solid, bruising gray and washes all the color out of the world. Ellie came home from the auto shop covered in a mix of grease and rainwater. She seemed more relaxed that evening. The tension that had been gripping her shoulders for weeks seemed to have vanished. She ordered a pizza, something they hadn't done in months, and they sat on the living room floor watching an old movie on the television. Halfway through the movie, Ellie turned to Sarah. The television bathed her face in a flickering blue light. She looked tired, but her eyes were incredibly soft. "You're a good kid, Sarah," Ellie said quietly. Sarah laughed, taking another slice of pizza. "I'm 19, Elle. I'm not a kid anymore." "I know," Ellie said. She reached out and rested her hand on Sarah's shoulder. Her grip was firm and grounding. "I know you're not. You're strong. You're going to do great things. I just want you to know that I'm proud of you. No matter what happens, you remember that, okay?" Sarah felt a strange chill run down her spine, but she brushed it off. "Thanks, Ellie. I'm proud of you too." Ellie smiled, pulled her hand back, and turned her attention back to the screen. The next morning was Thursday, October 14. The rain had not stopped. It was coming down in sheets, flooding the gutters and turning the dirt roads on the edge of town into thick mud. Sarah's classes were canceled for the day because of a power outage at the college, so she stayed in bed late. When she finally walked into the kitchen at 9 o'clock, she found a fresh pot of coffee waiting for her. A note was left on the counter, written in Ellie's neat, blocky handwriting. "Made coffee, see you for dinner, going to make a roast, love E." It was an ordinary note, a painfully ordinary note. At the auto shop, things proceeded exactly as usual. According to Arthur Miller, Ellie clocked in at exactly 7:45 a.m. She spent the morning rebuilding the transmission on a local farmer's pickup truck. Arthur later told police that Ellie was in a surprisingly good mood that day. She was whistling while she worked. She even joked around with the delivery driver who dropped off parts around noon. At 1:00 p.m., Ellie took her lunch break. She drove her Ford Ranger to the local diner just like she did every Thursday. The waitress, Betty, remembered her clearly. She ordered a turkey club sandwich and a slice of cherry pie, Betty would later recall to the investigators. She sat in her usual corner booth, but she didn't stay the whole hour. She ate fast, left a $5 tip on the table, and went outside to use the payphone by the gas pumps. Betty watched through the diner window as Ellie stood in the pouring rain, holding the phone to her ear. She didn't seem to be talking much. She was mostly listening. After about 2 minutes, Ellie hung up the phone. She didn't go back into the diner. She ran to her truck, got in, and drove back toward the auto shop. The afternoon dragged on. The rain continued to batter the metal roof of the garage. At 5:45 p.m., Ellie began wiping down her tools and putting them away in her heavy red toolbox. She was a meticulous worker. She wiped every wrench until it shined, placed it in its specific slot, and locked the drawer. At 6:00 p.m. exactly, she punched her time card. "See you tomorrow, Ellie," Arthur called out from the front office. "Have a good night, Art," Ellie replied. She zipped up her brown leather jacket, pulled her collar up against the rain, and walked out the door. Arthur watched her climb into her blue Ford Ranger. He watched the headlights click on, cutting through the dark, stormy evening. He watched her pull out of the parking lot and turn right, heading down the highway toward her house. She was supposed to go home. She was supposed to make a roast for dinner. At 7:00 p.m., Sarah was sitting in the living room reading a textbook. The roast was sitting on the kitchen counter, still wrapped in butcher paper. Ellie was usually home by 6:15 p.m. Sometimes, if traffic was bad or she had to stop for gas, she might be delayed until 6:30. By 7:30 p.m., Sarah started to feel a twinge of worry. She got up and looked out the front window. The street was empty. The rain was still falling heavily, splashing against the glass. By 8:00 p.m., the worry turned into a tight, hard knot in her chest. Ellie was never this late without calling. Never. Sarah picked up the phone and dialed the auto shop. It rang 6 times before the answering machine clicked on. Arthur had already gone home. Sarah paced the hallway. She checked the heavy chain lock on the front door. She checked the deadbolts. She walked from room to room, turning on every light in the house until it was glowing like a beacon in the dark. By 10:00 p.m., Sarah was fully panicking. She called the local hospital, asking if there had been any car accidents on the highway. The nurse on duty said it had been a quiet night. No accidents, no injuries. At midnight, Sarah finally called the Pine Ridge Police Department. The man who answered the phone was Deputy Mark Hayes. He was a young officer, barely older than Ellie, and he knew the Vance sisters well. He had gone to high school with them. "Calm down, Sarah," Deputy Hayes said. his voice soothing and steady over the line. "It's a terrible storm out there. Maybe her truck broke down on the old logging road and she decided to walk to a farmhouse to wait it out. I'll get in the cruiser and drive her route. I'll call you the second I see her." Sarah hung up the phone and sat on the couch, pulling her knees to her chest. She stared at the front door, praying for the sound of a key turning in the lock. She sat there for hours. She didn't sleep. She barely blinked. At 4:30 in the morning, the headlights of a police cruiser washed across the living room walls. Sarah didn't wait for a knock. She threw open the front door and ran out onto the porch into the freezing rain. Deputy Hayes was stepping out of his vehicle. He was not smiling. He looked pale, and the heavy yellow raincoat he wore was soaked through. He took off his hat as he walked up the wooden steps. "Sarah," he said softly, his voice cracked. "Where is she?" Sarah demanded, her voice shaking uncontrollably. "Where is my sister?" Deputy Hayes swallowed hard. "We found her truck, Sarah." "Okay, where is she? Is she at the station? Is she hurt?" "Sarah, please just listen to me." Hayes reached out and gently held her arms. "We found her truck parked on the old steel bridge crossing the Blackwood River. She wasn't in it." The old steel bridge was a rusted, towering structure located on a secondary county road about 4 miles outside of town. It was completely out of the way. It was not on the route between the auto shop and their house. There was absolutely no reason for Ellie to be driving out there in the middle of a massive rainstorm. 10 minutes later, Sarah was sitting in the passenger seat of Deputy Hayes's cruiser. They drove out to the bridge in silence. The rain was finally beginning to slow down, turning into a steady, miserable drizzle. The sky was just starting to turn a bruised, dark purple as the sun struggled to rise. When they arrived at the bridge, there were 2 other police cruisers parked near the edge, their red and blue lights flashing silently in the gray morning light. And right in the middle of the bridge, parked at a slight angle as if it had been stopped in a hurry, was Ellie's 1988 Ford Ranger. Sarah pushed the car door open and ran toward the truck before Hayes could stop her. Another officer caught her around the waist, pulling her back. "You can't go up there, sweetheart," the older officer said gently. "It's a scene." Sarah fought against him, screaming her sister's name into the wind. But the only answer was the roaring sound of the Blackwood River rushing furiously 50 feet below them, swollen and angry from the storm. When she finally stopped struggling, she looked closely at the truck. The headlights were still on, casting pale yellow beams into the mist. The driver's side door was swung completely wide open, exposed to the rain. The interior of the truck was soaked. Deputy Hayes walked up beside her, his face grim. "The engine was turned off," he explained quietly, "but the keys are still in the ignition. Her purse is tucked under the driver's seat. All her money, her ID, her credit cards, they're all still there." Sarah stared at the open door. It didn't make sense. Ellie loved that truck. She would never just leave the door open to the rain. She would never leave her keys behind. "Look on the dashboard," Hayes said, pointing a flashlight beam into the cab. Sitting on the dashboard, right above the steering wheel, was a styrofoam cup of coffee. It was half empty. It hadn't spilled. "She parked the car," Hayes said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "She turned off the engine. She left her purse. She stepped out into the rain." He hesitated, looking down at the rushing river below. Sarah, with the things she saw in the war, the trauma, a lot of soldiers, they don't know how to cope. We think she might have walked to the edge of the bridge. "No," Sarah snapped, her voice suddenly sharp and hard. "No, Ellie wouldn't do that. She wouldn't leave me. She promised me." "Sarah, the door was open. There are no signs of a struggle, no blood, no broken glass, just her truck, abandoned in the middle of the night." Sarah pulled away from the officers. She walked a few steps closer to the truck, ignoring the police tape they had begun to string up. She looked past the steering wheel, past the keys dangling in the ignition. She looked at the passenger seat. Resting neatly on the passenger seat was Ellie's faded brown leather jacket. It was folded perfectly in half. But that wasn't what made Sarah's heart stop. As she looked down at the floorboard on the passenger side, illuminated by the pale morning light, she saw something the police had missed in the dark. The floor mat was covered in thick, dark mud, and pressed perfectly into that mud was a single, clear boot print. Ellie wore a size 7 women's shoe. She wore standard work boots. The print on the floorboard was massive. It was a heavy, deeply treaded military-style boot, at least a men's size 12. It was fresh, and it was pointed directly toward the driver's seat. Someone else had been in the truck. Someone large, someone wearing heavy boots, and they had been sitting right next to Ellie in the dark. Sarah backed away from the truck, her breath catching in her throat. The police were already treating this as a tragic suicide. They were already writing the story of the broken veteran who couldn't handle the ghosts of her past. They were looking at the rushing river, assuming the water had taken her away. But as Sarah stared at that heavy, muddy boot print, a terrifying realization washed over her. Her sister didn't jump off this bridge. Her sister was taken. Sarah grabbed Deputy Hayes by the heavy fabric of his raincoat and pulled him toward the open door of the truck. She pointed a shaking finger at the muddy floorboard on the passenger side. "Look at it," she demanded, her voice cutting through the sound of the rain and the rushing river below. "Just look at it, Mark. That is not Ellie's footprint. She wears a size 7. That is a massive work boot. Someone was in this truck with her." Deputy Hayes leaned into the cab, shining his heavy metal flashlight onto the floor mat. For a moment, he stared at the deep, thick treads pressed perfectly into the dark mud. He frowned, the rain dripping from the brim of his hat. But then, an older man in a long gray trench coat walked up behind them. This was Detective Robert Larson. He was a veteran of the local police force, a man who had seen decades of small-town tragedies. He carried a weary, exhausted energy. Larson leaned over Hayes's shoulder, squinting at the mud. "She's a mechanic, Sarah," Detective Larson said, his voice surprisingly gentle but entirely dismissive. "She works in a garage all day. Mud and grease get tracked in and out of vehicles constantly. A heavy work boot print in a mechanic's truck isn't a crime scene. It's just part of her job." "It's fresh," Sarah argued, feeling a hot wave of panic and anger rising in her chest. "It's pointed right at the driver's seat. And look at her jacket. She wouldn't fold her leather jacket perfectly on the seat if she was going to jump. She loved that jacket. It makes no sense." Detective Larson sighed. He gave Deputy Hayes a subtle nod, and Hayes gently pulled Sarah away from the open door. "When people are hurting inside, Sarah, they do strange things," Larson explained, his tone shifting into the patronizing voice of an adult talking to a stubborn child. "People who want to end their lives often leave their personal items behind. The purse, the keys, the folded jacket. It's a way of letting go. We see it all the time with bridge jumpers. They strip away the things that tie them to the world." "She wasn't going to jump," Sarah screamed, the tears finally breaking free, mixing with the cold rain on her cheeks. "She bought a roast for dinner. She left me a note." "I'm sorry, Sarah," Larson said quietly. "We're going to get a dive team in the water as soon as the sun comes up." Over the next 3 days, Pine Ridge became the center of a massive, agonizing search. The storm finally broke, leaving the sky a pale, washed-out blue, but the damage to the landscape was already done. The Blackwood River was dangerously swollen, rushing with a violent, muddy fury that made the search incredibly difficult. State police dive teams arrived in heavy trucks, dragging specialized equipment down the muddy banks. They spent hours fighting the brutal currents, searching the cold depths below the rusted steel bridge. Volunteers from the town gathered in the surrounding woods. Hundreds of people who had thanked Ellie for her service just months before, now walked shoulder to shoulder through the dense pine forests, calling her name until their throats were raw. Search dogs were brought in to sniff Ellie's favorite faded jacket. The dogs tracked her scent directly to the middle of the bridge, right to the spot where her truck had been parked. And then the dogs simply stopped. They paced back and forth, whining at the edge of the steel railing. The scent vanished over the dark water. Every evening, Sarah sat on the riverbank, wrapped in a thick blanket, watching the divers pull themselves out of the freezing water with nothing to show for their efforts. The river was a thief. It held onto its secrets tightly. They found old tires, sunken logs, and rusted car parts, but they did not find Eleanor Vance. By the end of the first week, the volunteers started going back to their jobs. The state police packed up their diving gear, claiming the current was too dangerous and any evidence had likely washed miles downstream. The town of Pine Ridge began to accept the tragic narrative the police had constructed. It was a sad, simple story that made sense to them. The brave local soldier had come home carrying invisible wounds, and the weight of the war had finally pulled her under. The police officially reclassified the investigation as a recovery mission. The active search was over. Detective Larson called Sarah into his office on a quiet Tuesday morning to formally explain his conclusions. He slid a thin manila folder across his desk. It contained phone records and a few witness statements. "We looked into the phone call she made from the diner," Larson said, tapping the paper with his pen. "We traced the number. It was a public payphone located at a gas station 3 towns over. Whoever she called, they're gone. It's a dead end." Sarah stared at the paper. "What about the calls to our house, the late-night wrong numbers?" Larson shook his head. "Sarah, your sister was suffering from severe paranoia. It's a common symptom of post-traumatic stress. You told us yourself that she was installing new deadbolts and heavy chain locks on all the doors. Suicidal individuals often exhibit extreme anxiety and paranoid behavior in the weeks leading up to the event. They feel like the walls are closing in." "She was locking the doors because she was scared of someone," Sarah fired back, gripping the arms of her chair. "She was trying to keep someone out." "Or she was trying to keep herself locked in," Larson countered gently. "We spoke to the local VA hospital. They confirmed that the things she saw overseas were horrific. She carried a heavy burden. Sometimes the mind just breaks. We have to accept the reality of what the evidence is telling us." Sarah walked out of the police station that day feeling completely empty. The system was blind. The authorities had written the ending to Ellie's story on the very first morning, and they were simply twisting every piece of evidence to fit their chosen script. They didn't care about the massive boot print. They didn't care about the untraceable phone calls. They just wanted a neat, closed case. Returning to the empty house was the hardest part. The silence inside was suffocating. Every time Sarah walked through the front door, she was forced to look at the heavy metal chain lock Ellie had drilled into the wood just days before she vanished. Sarah spent hours sitting on the living room floor, staring at those locks. Suicidal people do not buy heavy-duty hardware to secure their homes. Suicidal people do not spend hours changing their driving routes to make sure they aren't being followed. Ellie was a trained soldier. She was highly observant. If Ellie believed she was in danger, then the danger was real. Weeks turned into months. Winter arrived in Oregon, burying the town of Pine Ridge under a thick blanket of heavy white snow. The Blackwood River partially froze over, sealing away any remaining secrets under a layer of jagged ice. The town moved on. The missing posters pinned to the bulletin board at the local grocery store began to fade and curl at the edges. Sarah dropped out of community college. She couldn't focus on textbooks and essays when her sister was out there somewhere. She took a full-time job at the local pharmacy, simply to pay the property taxes and keep the lights on in the house. She refused to move. She refused to leave the place where Ellie might one day return. By late January of 1994, Sarah had exhausted almost every avenue of her own private investigation. She had called Ellie's old military friends, but none of them had spoken to her in months. She had driven out to the gas station where the mysterious payphone call originated, but the attendant hadn't remembered seeing anyone suspicious. She was hitting the same dead ends the police had found. She was beginning to lose hope. The dark, terrifying thought that the police might have been right began to creep into the back of her mind during the lonely nights. Then, on a freezing Thursday afternoon, the phone in the kitchen rang. Sarah picked it up, her heart doing a familiar, painful stutter. "Hello." "Hey, Sarah, it's Arthur," a gruff voice said on the other end. It was Ellie's old boss from the auto repair shop. He sounded deeply uncomfortable. "Listen, kid, I'm real sorry to bother you, but I've got a new mechanic starting next week and I need to clear out bay number 3. Ellie's old toolbox is still sitting here. It's taking up a lot of space. I was hoping you could come down and take it home." Sarah swallowed hard, fighting back a wave of fresh grief. "Of course, Arthur. I'll be right there." She drove her battered sedan down the snowy highway to Miller's Auto Repair. Walking into the garage felt like stepping into a time machine. The air smelled exactly the same, a sharp, metallic blend of gasoline, burnt coffee, and heavy grease. It smelled like Ellie. Arthur helped her load the massive, heavy red metal toolbox into the trunk of her car. He gave her a sad, sympathetic hug before she drove away. When Sarah got the toolbox home, she dragged it into the hallway and left it there. She couldn't bring herself to open it. It felt like opening a coffin. It sat by the front door for 4 days, collecting dust. Finally, on Sunday night, the house was painfully quiet, and Sarah couldn't sleep. She walked out into the hallway in her pajamas, sat cross-legged on the floor, and reached out to the heavy metal latches of the toolbox. They clicked open with a loud, sharp snap. She opened the top lid. Everything was meticulously organized, exactly the way Ellie had left it at 5:45 p.m. on the day she vanished. The wrenches were polished and lined up by size. The screwdrivers rested in their dedicated slots. It was a perfect, logical system, a system built by a woman who demanded order and control in her life. Sarah slowly pulled open the drawers, one by one. She ran her fingers over the cold metal tools, feeling a desperate, aching connection to the sister she had lost. When she reached the very bottom drawer, she found Ellie's heavy equipment: rubber mallets, torque wrenches, and thick, heavy-duty ratchets. She began to pull them out, intending to wipe down the drawer before storing the box in the garage. As she removed the last heavy mallet, she noticed something strange. The bottom of every drawer was lined with a thick, textured black rubber mat to keep the tools from sliding around. But the mat in the bottom drawer wasn't sitting perfectly flat. The back right corner was slightly raised, as if something was wedged underneath it. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her hands began to tremble. She reached into the dark metal drawer, gripped the edge of the heavy rubber mat, and peeled it back. Hidden beneath the black liner, pressed perfectly flat against the cold steel of the drawer, was a thick manila envelope. It was sealed shut with heavy silver duct tape. Sarah pulled the envelope out. It was surprisingly heavy. She grabbed a pocket knife from the top drawer and carefully sliced through the tape, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. She turned the envelope upside down and shook the contents out onto the hardwood floor. 3 items spilled out. The first was a bank deposit book from a financial institution completely unknown to Sarah, located over 300 miles away in Seattle, Washington. She flipped it open. The account was under a fake name, but the handwriting was undeniably Ellie's. The balance listed on the final page, dated just 2 days before she disappeared, was a staggering $45,000. The second item was a small, tightly folded map of the Blackwood County region. Sarah unfolded it. The map was heavily marked with red ink. The rusted steel bridge where the truck was found was not circled. Instead, a thick red line traced a path deep into the heavily restricted federal logging lands north of the town, an area strictly off-limits to civilians. At the end of the red line was a single word written in all capital letters: extraction. But it was the third item that made the blood freeze in Sarah's veins. It was a small, square Polaroid photograph. Sarah picked it up with shaking fingers. The picture had been taken at night, shot through the front window of their own living room, looking out toward the dark street. In the center of the frame, parked directly under the shadow of the tall pine trees across from their house, was a dark, unmarked cargo van. Standing next to the van was a massive, towering man. His face was obscured by the shadows, but he was staring directly at the house, and clearly visible on his feet, illuminated by a distant street lamp, were heavy, deeply treaded military-style work boots. Sarah turned the photograph over. Written on the back in Ellie's desperate, rushed handwriting was a single, chilling sentence. "If I don't come home, do not trust the police." Sarah sat on the cold hardwood floor of the hallway for a long time, staring at the small, square Polaroid photograph. Her hands were shaking so violently that the edges of the picture blurred before her eyes. The heavy manila envelope, the bank deposit book, the map with the red line, they all lay scattered around her, mocking the tragedy the town had accepted. The police had told her a story about a broken soldier. They had painted a picture of a woman defeated by her own memories, a woman who had simply surrendered to the rushing waters of the Blackwood River. But the words written on the back of the photograph in her sister's own frantic handwriting completely destroyed that story. "If I don't come home, do not trust the police." Ellie had known. She had known they were coming for her. She had saved $45,000 in a secret account 300 miles away, preparing to run. She had mapped out an extraction point. She had taken a photograph of the man watching their house. She wasn't paranoid. She was being hunted. And the local police department was either dangerously incompetent, or they were directly involved. Sarah gathered the items from the floor with frantic, clumsy hands. She couldn't show this to Detective Larson. She couldn't show this to Deputy Hayes. If Ellie's warning was true, walking into the Pine Ridge Police Department with this envelope would be a death sentence. Sarah walked into her bedroom, pulled the heavy wooden dresser away from the wall, and used a screwdriver to pry off the baseboard. She shoved the plastic-wrapped envelope into the dark, dusty space between the wall studs, nailed the baseboard back into place, and pushed the dresser back. She told no one. She kept the secret buried. She thought that if she just waited, if she just kept her eyes open, the people who took Ellie would eventually make a mistake. She thought she would find a clue on her own. But time is a cruel and quiet thief. It does not stop for grief, and it does not pause for unsolved mysteries. Years began to roll by. The seasons changed in Pine Ridge. The thick snows of winter melted into the muddy springs, which dried into short, dusty summers, only to freeze over again. The town slowly moved on. The missing person posters that had once plastered every telephone pole and storefront window eventually weathered, tore, and were covered up by advertisements for local garage sales and high school football games. By the year 2000, Ellie Vance was no longer a headline. She was a ghost story. She was a tragic local legend that parents used as a warning when their teenagers stayed out too late near the old steel bridge. But Sarah never moved on. She lived in the same single-story house on the edge of town. She never removed the heavy chain locks Ellie had installed. In fact, she added more. She bought a pump-action shotgun and kept it under her bed. She learned how to shoot. She adopted a routine that was eerily similar to the one her sister had lived by. Sarah cut her hair short. She stopped trusting strangers. She became the manager of the local pharmacy, working long hours, living a quiet, isolated, and highly observant life. She watched the people of Pine Ridge age. She watched Arthur Miller, the owner of the auto shop, pass away from a sudden heart attack in 2004. She watched Detective Robert Larson retire and move away to a warmer climate down south, taking his patronizing tone and his neatly closed case files with him. She also watched Deputy Mark Hayes climb the ranks. Over the decades, the young, sympathetic deputy who had found Ellie's truck became a sergeant, then a lieutenant, and finally, the chief of police. Chief Hayes always made it a point to stop by the pharmacy once a month to check on Sarah. He would buy a pack of gum, ask about her house, and offer a sad, knowing smile. He still treated her like the fragile, grieving sister he had met in the freezing rain all those years ago. Sarah always smiled back. She always played the part. But behind her polite retail smile, she was always studying him. She was studying everyone. By the autumn of 2014, 21 years had passed since the night Ellie's truck was found on the bridge. Sarah was now 42 years old. She had spent more than half her life living in the shadow of a mystery that seemed destined to die with her. The hope of ever finding out what happened to her sister had slowly calcified into a dull, heavy ache in her chest. Then one Tuesday evening in late October, the trigger was finally pulled. It was a quiet night. A heavy, relentless rain was falling outside, drumming against the roof of the house, sounding almost exactly like the rain from the night Ellie disappeared. Sarah was sitting in the living room, reading a book under the dim light of a floor lamp. At 8:15 p.m., the landline phone in the kitchen rang. Sarah frowned. Nobody called the landline anymore. She only kept it connected out of pure, stubborn sentimentality. It was the same phone number Ellie had called all those years ago. She walked into the kitchen and picked up the receiver. "Hello," she said, her voice cautious. For a moment there was only the sound of static and the faint crackle of a bad connection. Then an older man's voice spoke. He sounded exhausted and his breathing was heavy. "Is this Sarah Vance?" the man asked. "Yes," Sarah replied, her grip tightening on the plastic receiver. "Who is this?" "My name is David Barrett," the man said. His voice was trembling slightly. "You don't know me, Ms. Vance. I'm a retired state land surveyor. I do private contract work now for a commercial timber company out of Portland. They hired me to survey the old federal logging tracts north of Pine Ridge, Sector 4, the deep woods." Sarah's heart skipped a heavy, painful beat. Sector 4. That was the restricted area marked with the thick red line on Ellie's old map. "Why are you calling me?" Sarah asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I was out there this afternoon," David continued, the words tumbling out of him quickly, as if he was afraid he might lose his nerve. "I was marking trees near an old, collapsed ravine. The area is totally overgrown. Hasn't been touched by human hands in decades. While I was clearing some brush, my shovel hit something metal buried deep under a rotting tree stump." Sarah stopped breathing. The kitchen felt like it was spinning. "It was a rusted metal lockbox," David said. "Heavy steel. The padlock was completely corroded, so I took a crowbar to the hinges and popped it open. I thought maybe some kids had buried a time capsule or something." He paused, and Sarah could hear him swallow hard over the line. "What was inside, David?" she demanded, her voice suddenly sharp and desperate. "A military dog tag," he whispered. "It said Vance, Eleanor, and there was a small laminated card wrapped around the chain. It had this phone number on it, and a message written in black marker." "What did the message say?" "It said, 'Call my sister. Do not call the police. They are listening.' So I didn't call the police, Ms. Vance. I drove straight back to town. I'm sitting at the corner booth of the old truck stop diner on Highway 9. I have the box." "Do not leave," Sarah said instantly. "Do not talk to anyone. I will be there in 10 minutes." She slammed the phone down. 21 years of waiting, 21 years of silence had just shattered in an instant. She ran to her bedroom, grabbed her heavy raincoat, and pulled the shotgun from beneath her bed. She didn't care if it seemed dramatic. She wrapped the weapon in a dark blanket and carried it out to her SUV. The drive to the truck stop diner felt like a blur. The rain was washing across the windshield in thick waves. When she arrived, the diner was mostly empty. The neon sign buzzed loudly in the wet night air. Sarah walked inside, scanning the room. In the far back corner, sitting rigidly with a cup of untouched coffee in front of him, was an older man with gray hair and a weathered, lined face. He wore a bright orange surveyor's vest over a flannel shirt. Resting on the table in front of him, covered in fresh, dark mud, was a small, heavy steel box. Sarah slid into the booth across from him. She didn't introduce herself. She just stared at the box. David pushed it across the table toward her. His hands were shaking. "I shouldn't have opened it," he said quietly. "I'm sorry, but when I saw the name, I remembered the stories. Everyone knows about the army girl who jumped off the bridge." "She didn't jump," Sarah said firmly. She pulled the box closer and looked inside. The metal interior smelled of old earth and damp rust. Sitting at the bottom was a silver military dog tag. Sarah reached out and touched it. The cold metal sent a shockwave of grief straight through her chest. It was Ellie's. But it wasn't the only thing in the box. Beside the dog tag rested a single, heavy brass key, the kind used for large industrial padlocks. And beneath the key was a small, black, leather-bound notebook. The pages were slightly warped from years of being buried in the damp earth, but it was still intact. Sarah picked up the notebook and carefully opened it to the first page. It was a ledger. The pages were filled with Ellie's precise, blocky handwriting. There were dates going back to early 1992, right after Ellie had started working at Miller's Auto Repair. Next to the dates were long strings of numbers that Sarah quickly recognized as vehicle identification numbers, or VINs, and next to those numbers were massive cash figures: $20,000, $50,000, $80,000. Sarah flipped the page. There were notes scrawled in the margins. "Arthur modifies the engine blocks. They scratch the VINs and restamp them at night. The cargo vans are federal surplus, sold at auction, then retrofitted in bay number 3 to hide the compartments." Sarah's eyes widened. Ellie had stumbled into a massive criminal operation. Someone was stealing heavy federal surplus vehicles, bringing them to the quiet town of Pine Ridge, and using Arthur Miller's auto shop as a front to modify them, disguise them, and build hidden smuggling compartments inside them. She turned another page. The handwriting grew more rushed, more frantic. "They are moving the stolen shipments through the restricted logging routes in Sector 4. Nobody goes up there. It's the perfect corridor across the state line, but they couldn't do it without local coverage. The trucks are too big. They need an escort on the county roads to bypass the way stations." Sarah's breath hitched. She looked at the final entry in the notebook, dated exactly 1 week before Ellie vanished. "I matched the patrol logs to the shipping dates. The escorts are coming from our own precinct. The local cops are running the route. They know I saw the vans in the garage. They know I recognize the military specs. They are watching the house. I have the extraction van coordinates. If I can get to Sector 4 before they move the fleet, I can prove it." Sarah closed the notebook slowly, the sound of the diner fatting away around her. It all made sense. The paranoid behavior, the locks on the doors, the strange phone calls. Ellie wasn't suffering from a mental breakdown. She was a mechanic who noticed something wrong with an engine, pulled the thread, and unraveled a massive, multi-million-dollar smuggling ring operating right under the nose of a quiet logging town. And the police hadn't failed to investigate Ellie's disappearance. They had orchestrated it. "Ms. Vance," David asked softly, pulling Sarah back to reality, "should we call the state police, the FBI?" "No," Sarah said, slipping the notebook, the key, and the dog tag into her coat pocket. "We don't know who is on the payroll. We don't know how deep this goes. You need to leave town tonight, David. Go back to Portland. Forget you ever found this. Forget you ever met me." David looked terrified, but he nodded. He stood up, left a $10 bill on the table, and walked out into the rain without another word. Sarah sat alone in the booth for a few minutes, her mind racing. She had the ledger. She had the motive. But she didn't have the proof of what actually happened to her sister. The ledger proved Ellie was investigating them, but it didn't prove they killed her. She thought about the map hidden in her bedroom wall, the red line, the word extraction. She thought about the brass key in her pocket. If Ellie was planning to expose them, she would have gone to the source. She would have gone to the place where they hid the vans. Sarah drove back to her house. She didn't turn on any lights. She moved through the dark hallway, went into her bedroom, and pried the baseboard off the wall again. She pulled out the old manila envelope and retrieved the 1993 map. She laid it out on her bed next to a modern GPS device. Sector 4 was a massive, dense expanse of untamed wilderness. But the red line on Ellie's map led to a very specific set of geographical coordinates, deep inside a valley known as the Devil's Wash, a steep, dangerous ravine that loggers had abandoned in the 1970s. It was miles away from any paved road. Sarah changed into heavy hiking boots. She packed a large tactical flashlight, a first aid kit, extra batteries, and a heavy crowbar into a backpack. She picked up the Blanketrap shotgun, loaded the tube with heavy buckshot, and slung it over her shoulder. She was going to the extraction point. The drive took over an hour. Sarah navigated her SUV up the treacherous, winding mountain roads, miles past the old steel bridge where Ellie's truck had been found 21 years ago. The pavement soon turned to cracked gravel, and the gravel eventually faded into deep, muddy, overgrown logging trails. Finally, the trees became too dense for the vehicle to pass. Sarah parked the SUV deep in a thick grove of fir trees, cut the engine, and stepped out into the freezing, rain-soaked night. The darkness of the Pacific Northwest woods was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating blackness that seemed to swallow the beam of her flashlight. The air smelled of rotting pine needles and wet earth. Every snapping twig sounded like a gunshot. Every gust of wind through the high branches sounded like a low, warning whisper. Sarah hiked for nearly 2 hours, following the GPS coordinates, comparing them against the faded red line on Ellie's map. She fought her way through thick, thorny underbrush, sliding down muddy embankments, her boots sinking deep into the freezing muck. Just after midnight, she reached the edge of the Devil's Wash. It was a massive, steep ravine, carved out of the mountain by an ancient, dried-up riverbed. Sarah stood at the edge, shining her powerful flashlight down into the deep, bowl-shaped depression. At first, she saw nothing but dead trees and massive boulders. But as she swept the beam across the floor of the ravine, the light caught something unnatural. It was a massive mound, covered in thick layers of dead moss, fallen branches, and decaying leaves. But the shape was too perfectly rectangular to be a natural rock formation. And draped over the top of the mound, barely visible beneath the decades of forest decay, was the shredded, rotting fabric of military-grade camouflage netting. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She scrambled down the steep, muddy side of the ravine, slipping and sliding until she hit the rocky floor. She ran toward the mound, dropping her shotgun to the ground. She grabbed a thick, dead branch and began furiously scraping the moss and leaves away. She tore at the rotting camouflage netting, pulling it down in heavy, wet sheets. Metal scraped against metal. Underneath the decades of overgrowth, hidden in the darkest corner of the restricted forest, was a vehicle. Sarah stepped back and shined her flashlight over it. It was a massive, dark blue cargo van. The tires were completely rotted away, the vehicle resting on its rusted metal rims. The paint was peeling and covered in thick brown rust, but the shape was unmistakable. It was the exact same unmarked van from the Polaroid photograph, the van that had been parked outside their house. Sarah walked slowly to the back of the vehicle. The heavy double doors were sealed shut. Hanging from the latch was a massive, industrial steel padlock. It was coated in rust, but it looked incredibly heavy. Sarah reached into her pocket with trembling fingers. She pulled out the single brass key she had found in the strongbox. She slid the key into the padlock. It resisted at first. She gripped it hard, her knuckles turning white, and forced it to turn. With a loud, grinding asterisk crack, the rusty internal mechanism gave way. The padlock popped open. Sarah pulled the heavy lock off the latch, let it drop into the mud, and grabbed the rusted handles of the back doors. She planted her boots in the dirt and pulled with all her strength. The doors groaned in protest, a terrible, shrieking sound of metal tearing against metal, before finally giving way and swinging outward into the cold night air. A wave of stale, suffocating, metallic-smelling air washed over her face. Sarah raised her flashlight and aimed the beam inside the pitch-black cargo hold. The back of the van had been completely stripped. There were no seats. There were no cargo racks. Instead, the walls were lined with heavy, reinforced steel plating. Bolted to the metal floor in the center of the space was a single, heavy metal chair. But it was what was attached to the wall that made Sarah's blood run cold. Thick, heavy chains hung from heavy iron rings bolted directly into the steel frame. At the end of the chains were rusted metal handcuffs. It wasn't a smuggling compartment. It was a makeshift holding cell. It was a mobile prison. Sarah stepped up into the back of the van, the rusted metal floor groaning under her weight. Her flashlight beam trembled as she swept it across the space. In the far corner, sitting perfectly upright on the dusty, rusted floor, was a pair of boots. They were heavy, deeply treaded, military-style work boots, size 12. They were exactly the same boots that had left the muddy footprint inside Ellie's truck 21 years ago. And resting on the floor right beside the boots, half covered in a layer of dust and dried leaves that had blown in through a crack in the roof, was a heavy metal object. Sarah walked over and crouched down. She brushed the dirt away. It was a heavy, police-issued tactical flashlight. The metal casing was scratched and worn. Sarah picked it up. It felt heavy and cold in her hand. She turned it over, shining her own light onto the side of the handle. Engraved deep into the metal casing were 2 words: Property of Pine Ridge PD badge number. Before she could read the numbers, a sound shattered the silence of the forest. Sarah froze. Above the ravine, somewhere near the tree line where she had parked her SUV, came the loud, distinct sound of heavy tires crunching over the wet gravel. An engine rumbled, low and powerful, completely out of place in the restricted logging lands. Then the sudden sound of a car door slamming shut echoed across the valley. Someone was up there. And then the sweeping beam of a massive, high-powered spotlight cut through the trees above, sweeping down the side of the ravine, searching the darkness, searching for her. The sweeping beam of the high-powered spotlight cut through the heavy branches of the pine trees above, slicing down into the dark ravine like a glowing white blade. It moved in slow, methodical sweeps, illuminating the dead moss and the massive, wet boulders. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She instantly killed the power on her own flashlight, plunging the inside of the rusted cargo van into total darkness. She pressed her back hard against the reinforced steel wall of the mobile prison, clutching the heavy police flashlight she had just picked up from the floor. Up on the ridge, the deep, rumbling engine of the vehicle cut off. The forest was suddenly plunged back into an eerie silence, broken only by the relentless drumming of the freezing rain. Then Sarah heard the heavy, distinct sound of boots sliding down the muddy embankment. Someone was coming down into the Devil's Wash. Panic flared hot and bright in Sarah's chest, but the survival instincts she had honed over 21 years of waiting immediately took over. She couldn't stay in the van. If whoever was coming down that hill reached the open doors, she would be trapped in a steel box with no way out. Moving completely blind in the pitch black, she slipped the police flashlight into her coat pocket. She carefully stepped out of the back of the van, the rusted metal groaning softly under her weight, and dropped her boots silently into the thick mud. She crouched low, grabbing her shotgun from the ground, and scrambled around to the side of the vehicle, pressing herself flat against the cold, wet metal of the front tire rim. Less than 30 seconds later, the blinding white beam of the spotlight hit the back of the van. Sarah held her breath. She squeezed her eyes shut against the harsh glare reflecting off the mud. "Dispatch, this is Car 1. A deep, heavily weathered voice echoed through the ravine, followed by the sharp burst of radio static. "I'm down in Sector 4. The old Devil's Wash, somebody cut the perimeter chain on the fire road." Sarah felt a wave of pure ice flood her veins. She knew that voice. She had heard that voice comfort her in the freezing rain 21 years ago. She had heard that voice ask her about her day at the pharmacy just last month. It was Chief Mark Hayes. "Copy that, Chief," a dispatcher's voice crackled through a handheld radio. "Do you need backup?" "Negative," Hayes replied, his voice completely flat and void of any emotion. "Probably just some teenagers out drinking. I'm checking the abandoned logging equipment now. I'll clear the area and head back to the highway." He was lying to his own dispatcher. He wasn't checking logging equipment. He was checking his hidden extraction van. Sarah listened to the heavy crunch of his boots walking toward the back of the van. She heard him stop. For a long, terrifying moment, there was nothing but the sound of the rain. She knew exactly what he was looking at. He was looking at the broken, rusted padlock lying in the mud. He was looking at the doors swung wide open. "Damn it," Hayes hissed under his breath. The radio clicked completely off. Sarah knew she had seconds to move. While Hayes stepped up into the back of the van to inspect the interior, she threw herself onto her stomach and crawled blindly into the thick, thorny underbrush at the edge of the ravine. The thorns tore through her heavy coat, scratching her face and hands, but she didn't make a sound. She dragged the heavy shotgun behind her, burying herself deep inside a thick patch of rotting ferns. A moment later, Hayes jumped down from the van. The powerful beam of his flashlight violently swept the surrounding woods, passing inches above Sarah's head. She pressed her face directly into the freezing mud, closing her eyes, praying her dark coat blended into the shadows. "I know you're out here," Hayes yelled out into the rain, his voice losing its calm, professional tone, replaced by something rough and dangerous. "There's only one road out of this valley." Sarah didn't move. She waited, letting the freezing rain soak through her clothes. She listened as Hayes furiously kicked the side of the van, cursed it into the darkness, and finally began the heavy, slipping climb back up the muddy embankment to his vehicle. When she heard his engine roar to life, she finally exhaled a shaky, terrified breath. But she didn't wait for him to leave. She knew he wouldn't just drive away. He was going to set up a blockade on the main logging road. He was going to trap whoever had opened that van. Sarah crawled on her hands and knees for nearly 20 minutes, fighting her way up the opposite side of the steep ravine. When she finally reached the top, her muscles were burning, and she was covered in a thick layer of wet earth. She sprinted through the dark woods, completely abandoning stealth, running purely on adrenaline until she finally reached the thick grove of fir trees where she had hidden her SUV. She climbed into the driver's seat, her hands shaking violently. She didn't turn the headlights on. She knew the layout of these back roads better than anyone. She shifted the car into neutral, let off the emergency brake, and allowed the heavy SUV to roll silently down the dark, muddy fire road, coasting through the thick pines for over a mile before she finally dared to turn the key in the ignition. By the time Sarah made it back to her house on the edge of Pine Ridge, it was almost 3 in the morning. She locked the heavy deadbolts, engaged the chain locks, and collapsed against the front door, sliding down to the hardwood floor. She was completely exhausted, but her mind was racing with a terrifying, impossible clarity. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the heavy metal flashlight she had taken from the floor of the van. She turned on the dim hallway lamp and held the flashlight up to the light, wiping away decades of caked-on dirt and rust with her thumb. The engraved letters on the metal handle became clear. Property of Pine Ridge PD, badge number 402. Sarah slowly stood up. She walked into the living room, went to the small wooden desk in the corner, and pulled open the bottom drawer. Inside was a thick scrapbook she had compiled over the last 2 decades. It was filled with newspaper clippings, police reports, and photographs from the month Ellie disappeared. She flipped past the missing posters and the articles about the river search. She stopped on a faded, yellowed clipping from the Pine Ridge Gazette, dated October 20, 1993. The headline read, "Local Deputy LEADS Search for Missing Veteran." Below the headline was a large black and white photograph of a young, sorrowful Deputy Mark Hayes standing at a podium, asking the public for any information. Sarah stared at the photograph. She looked closely at the young deputy's chest. Pinned perfectly to his crisp, neat uniform was a silver star shield. The numbers engraved on the shield were 402. The flashlight in the van belonged to him. The size 12 muddy boots belonged to him. The perfectly folded leather jacket on the passenger seat of Ellie's truck was a staging tactic, designed to look like a suicide. Mark Hayes was the monster who had swallowed her sister. But it didn't make sense. It just didn't. How could a 24-year-old patrol deputy run a multi-million-dollar federal smuggling ring all by himself? He couldn't have retrofitted the heavy cargo vans. He didn't have the mechanical skills. He needed someone with a garage, someone with heavy equipment. Sarah opened the small black leather notebook she had recovered from the strongbox. She turned to the pages filled with Ellie's blocky handwriting. Arthur modifies the engine blocks. They scratch the VINs and restamp them at night. The cargo vans are federal surplus. Arthur Miller, Ellie's boss. Sarah turned to her old desktop computer sitting on the desk. She waited agonizing minutes for the dial-up connection to connect to the internet. The year was 2014, and public records were finally starting to be digitized. She went to the county database and pulled up the birth and death certificates for Pine Ridge. She searched for Arthur Miller. He had died of a heart attack 10 years ago. She found his obituary. She scanned the short paragraph detailing his life, his long career as a mechanic, and his surviving family members. Her eyes stopped on a single sentence near the bottom. Arthur is survived by his loving sister, Margaret Hayes, and his nephew, Pine Ridge Police Chief Mark Hayes. Sarah felt all the air leave her lungs. The auto shop and the police department weren't just working together. They were blood. It was a family business. Uncle and nephew stealing federal surplus vehicles, heavily modifying them in a quiet town, and running them across the state line using police cruisers as escorts. Ellie hadn't just stumbled into a local crime. She had walked directly into a heavily armed family syndicate. Sarah looked back at the notebook. She focused on one specific sentence Ellie had written just days before she vanished. "They are retrofitting the vans in Bay Number 3. I found the drop space beneath the hydraulic lift." Sarah's eyes widened. She remembered the phone call she had received from Arthur Miller just a few months after the search ended. "I need to clear out Bay Number 3. Ellie's old toolbox is still sitting here. It's taking up a lot of space." Why did Arthur need Bay Number 3 cleared out so urgently? The auto shop had 2 other massive bays. And why was Ellie's toolbox the only thing left in there? Because the real crime scene wasn't the bridge. It was never the bridge. The answer wasn't lost in the rushing waters of the Blackwood River. The answer was buried right in the middle of town, under the concrete of an abandoned garage. Sarah looked at the clock on the wall. It was 4:15 a.m. The town was dead asleep. The rain had finally stopped, leaving a heavy, freezing fog rolling through the empty streets. Miller's auto repair had been boarded up and abandoned since Arthur died in 2004. The property had been tied up in a complicated probate dispute and had simply sat there, rotting quietly on the edge of the highway, overgrown with weeds and forgotten by the town. Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed the heavy steel crowbar from her backpack, reloaded her pump-action shotgun, and put on a dry coat. She walked out of her house, climbed into her SUV, and drove straight down the main road toward the old garage. When she arrived, the auto shop looked like a haunted house. The large glass windows of the front office were shattered, and thick sheets of plywood were nailed over the doors. A rusty chain-link fence surrounded the property, but the padlock on the front gate was old and brittle. Sarah wrapped a thick rag around the padlock to muffle the sound, raised her heavy steel crowbar, and brought it down hard. The lock shattered into 3 pieces on the second strike. She pushed the gate open, the rusty hinges screaming quietly in the fog, and walked across the cracked, weed-choked asphalt toward the massive rolling metal doors of the garage bays. Bay 1, Bay 2, Bay number 3. The rolling door for the third bay was chained shut from the inside, but there was a small, heavy metal side door meant for employees. Sarah jammed the flattened end of the crowbar into the door frame, right near the lock. She threw all her weight against the steel bar, gritting her teeth, her muscles screaming with effort. With a loud crack of splintering wood and bending metal, the side door popped open. Sarah stepped inside. The smell hit her instantly. It was the exact same smell she remembered from 21 years ago. Stale motor oil, burnt coffee, and heavy grease. The air inside the garage was thick and suffocating. She clicked on her heavy tactical flashlight and swept the beam across the massive room. The garage was a graveyard of old car parts, stacked tires, and rusted metal shelves. Dust hung thick in the air, swirling in the beam of her light. She walked past the first 2 bays. They were filled with absolute junk. But as she approached bay number 3, she noticed a massive difference. The floor of bay number 3 was completely empty. It was swept clean. And resting in the absolute center of the concrete floor was a massive, industrial hydraulic lift, the kind used to raise large commercial trucks into the air. The metal lift was heavily rusted, bolted directly into the concrete floor. Sarah walked up to it. She shined her light onto the floor around the base of the lift. She remembered what Ellie's notebook had said. "I found the drop space beneath the hydraulic lift." Sarah looked closer at the concrete. The entire floor of bay number 3 was solid, poured cement. But right beneath the massive metal platform of the hydraulic lift, there was a perfect rectangular outline cut into the floor. It was a heavy steel trapdoor, designed to look perfectly flush with the concrete. You would never see it unless the lift was raised into the air. Sarah frantically searched the wall for the lift controls. She found a heavy gray metal box bolted to a steel support beam. She ripped the cover off. The power to the building had been cut a decade ago, but this was an old-school pneumatic lift. It didn't rely strictly on electricity. It had a manual pressure release valve designed for emergencies. She grabbed a heavy wrench from a nearby workbench, attached it to the large release valve inside the control box, and threw her entire body weight against it. For a long moment nothing happened. The rust was too thick. The machine was frozen in time. "Come on," Sarah whispered through clenched teeth. "Please." She pulled again, screaming with effort, putting 21 years of anger and grief into the cold steel. With a loud, violent crack, the valve broke free. A massive, deafening hiss of compressed air echoed through the empty garage. The massive metal platform of the hydraulic lift shuddered violently. Slowly, with the terrible, grinding sound of neglected metal, the massive lift began to rise into the air, inch by inch, slowly revealing the floor beneath it. When the platform was 6 feet in the air, the hissing stopped. The lift locked into place. Sarah walked back to the center of the bay. The steel trapdoor was fully exposed. There was no padlock. There was just a heavy, recessed metal ring designed to be pulled upward. Sarah dropped the wrench. She grabbed the cold metal ring with both hands, planted her boots firmly on the concrete, and pulled. The heavy door groaned, resisting the movement, before finally lifting open, falling back against the concrete floor with a heavy, echoing thud. A wave of cold, stagnant, terrifyingly still air rose from the dark hole in the floor. Sarah shined her flashlight down into the opening. There was a steep, narrow set of wooden stairs leading down into a small, windowless sub-basement, a hidden mechanics pit that had been expanded into a secret underground room. Sarah gripped her flashlight tightly in her left hand and raised her heavy shotgun with her right. She stepped onto the first wooden stair. It creaked loudly. She slowly descended into the earth, the temperature dropping sharply with every step. When she reached the bottom, she swept the beam of her light across the darkness. It was a storage room. The walls were lined with heavy wooden shelves, but the shelves weren't holding auto parts. They were stacked high with old, dusty cardboard boxes. Sarah stepped closer to the nearest shelf and aimed her light at the side of a box. Stamped across the cardboard in heavy black ink were the words, "Pine Ridge Police Department Evidence." The room wasn't just a smuggling drop space. It was Chief Hayes's personal vault. He had been stealing evidence, storing contraband, and running his entire corrupt empire from beneath his uncle's auto shop. But Sarah wasn't looking for stolen evidence. She was looking for Ellie. She moved deeper into the small underground room, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. The air down here was heavy with the smell of damp earth and something else, something dry and metallic. At the very back of the room, tucked behind a stack of rusted oil drums, her flashlight beam hit something unnatural. It was a small, perfectly square section of the concrete wall that looked entirely different from the rest of the foundation. The concrete was rougher, sloppier. It had clearly been poured much later than the original walls. Sarah walked toward it, her breath turning into small white clouds in the freezing air. Sitting on the dirt floor, directly in front of the roughly poured section of concrete, was an old, faded plastic milk crate. And resting on top of the milk crate, covered in 21 years of dust, was a dark blue canvas military duffel bag. Sarah dropped her shotgun to the ground. It landed with a heavy clatter that seemed terrifyingly loud in the small room. She fell to her knees in front of the milk crate. She recognized the bag instantly. It was the exact same duffel bag Ellie had packed when she left for the army. It was the bag she brought home, the bag she kept in her closet. Sarah reached out with trembling, freezing fingers. She gripped the heavy brass zipper of the duffel bag and slowly pulled it open. Inside the bag, perfectly folded and neatly stacked, were the items the police claimed had washed away in the river. Sarah pulled out a dark blue mechanic's shirt. Woven into the front pocket was a small white name patch, ELLIE. The shirt was heavily stained with massive, dark, dried patches of rust-colored blood. Tucked beneath the shirt was a heavy, silver wrench. It was also coated in the same dark, dried substance. It was the weapon. And resting at the very bottom of the bag, wrapped carefully in a plastic evidence bag, was a single styrofoam coffee cup, the exact matching half to the cup that had been left on the dashboard of the truck. Sarah pressed a shaking hand against her mouth, a choked, broken sob escaping her lips. The story was finally clear. Ellie didn't leave the garage at 6:00 p.m. that night. She never drove her truck to the bridge. She stayed behind. She went into bay number 3 to document the drop space. She found the sub-basement. And Mark Hayes had caught her down here. There had been a struggle, a violent, terrible fight in this very room. Hayes had killed her with her own wrench. He packed her bloody clothes into her own duffel bag. He poured a fresh layer of concrete into the back wall of the foundation to hide the body. And then, under the cover of the massive rainstorm, he drove her truck to the steel bridge, parked it, set the coffee cup on the dash, folded her leather jacket, and walked away in his heavy size 12 boots. He manufactured a suicide to cover up a murder. Sarah slowly raised her hands and pressed them flat against the rough, uneven concrete of the back wall. She closed her eyes, tears finally spilling over her cheeks, cutting through the dirt and mud on her face. She was here, After 21 years, Sarah had finally found her sister. Suddenly, the heavy, emotional silence of the underground room was violently shattered. From directly above her, up in the massive empty space of Bay Number 3, came the unmistakable, echoing sound of the heavy metal side door being kicked completely open. Sarah froze, her eyes snapped open. Heavy, deliberate footsteps began to walk slowly across the concrete floor above. They were heavy boots, size 12. They walked past the first bay. They walked past the second bay. The footsteps stopped directly at the edge of the open trapdoor. And then Chief Mark Hayes's voice echoed down the narrow wooden staircase, cold, flat, and entirely devoid of mercy. "I knew I should have poured that concrete thicker, Sarah." Sarah's heart stopped completely. The freezing air in the underground room suddenly felt heavy, pressing against her lungs until she could barely draw a breath. She stared into the absolute darkness at the top of the wooden stairs. The blinding white beam of a police flashlight clicked on, cutting through the dusty air, aiming directly down into the pit, pinning her against the rough concrete wall like a trapped animal. Behind the glaring light, the massive silhouette of Chief Mark Hayes filled the narrow doorway. He didn't rush. He didn't yell. He stood at the top of the stairs with the terrifying, relaxed posture of a man who believed he was in complete control of the world. In his right hand, resting casually against his thigh, was his heavy black service pistol. "You always were too stubborn for your own good, Sarah," Hayes said. His voice was a low, smooth rumble that echoed off the cold basement walls. "Just like your sister, you both just couldn't leave well enough alone." Sarah's body reacted before her conscious mind could process the fear. Her survival instincts, honed through 2 decades of paranoia and grief, completely took over. She dropped her own flashlight. It hit the dirt floor and rolled, casting wild, spinning shadows across the room. In the same fluid motion, Sarah dove to the ground, grabbing the cold metal barrel of the pump-action shotgun she had dropped moments earlier. She rolled onto her back, pulled the heavy weapon tight against her shoulder, and aimed it directly up the narrow wooden staircase. "Don't take another step," Sarah screamed, her voice cracking with a raw, violent intensity she didn't know she possessed. Hayes let out a short, dry laugh. He took 1 step down the creaking wooden stairs. "You're not going to shoot me, Sarah," he said calmly, taking another step. The old wood groaned under his heavy boots. "You're a pharmacist. You've lived in this quiet little town your whole life. You don't know how to pull a trigger on a human being. Ellie knew how, the army taught her that, but you're just a scared little girl." Sarah's hands were trembling violently, but she did not lower the barrel of the shotgun. "You killed her," she whispered, tears of pure rage burning in her eyes. "You beat her to death in this basement." Hayes paused halfway down the stairs. The beam of his flashlight remained locked on Sarah's face. He sighed, a heavy, tired sound, as if he was merely a teacher explaining a difficult math problem to a slow student. "She left me no choice," Hayes said, his voice void of any remorse. "We had a multi-million-dollar federal pipeline running right through this town. My Uncle Arthur was a genius with engines, but he was careless. He didn't clean up his workspace. Ellie found the altered VIN plates. She found the ledger. She figured out the whole damn operation in a matter of weeks." He took another step down. He was only 10 feet away from her now. "We tried to buy her off, Sarah," Hayes continued. "I stood right in this room, and I offered your sister $100,000 in cash to just walk away, to pack her bags, take you, and leave Pine Ridge forever. But she was so entirely righteous. She had all those rigid military rules. She looked me in the eye and told me she was going to burn my badge and put my uncle in prison." Sarah gripped the shotgun tighter. Her knuckles turned pure white. "So you murdered her." "I protected my family," Hayes corrected coldly. "She went for her heavy wrench. She was fast. She hit me hard in the shoulder, but she was small, Sarah, and I am not. When it was over, I realized I couldn't just bury her in the woods. People would look for her. The army would look for her. I had to give the town a story they could understand. He smiled, a dark, terrible curve of his lips in the shadows. And they bought it instantly, he whispered. The broken soldier, the tragic hero who couldn't handle the memories of war. I drove her truck to the bridge in the middle of the storm. I folded her jacket. I left the keys in the ignition. It was the perfect stage. Everyone believed it, even you. I never believed it, Sarah fired back, her voice shaking with absolute venom. I saw your footprint. I saw the boot print you left in the mud on the floorboard. I knew someone was there. For a fraction of a second, the calm arrogance on Hayes's face slipped. His eyes widened slightly. He hadn't realized he had made a mistake that night. He had never known about the muddy footprint. The realization angered him. His grip tightened on his pistol, and he raised the weapon, pointing it directly at Sarah's chest. "Well," Hayes said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, lethal growl, "it doesn't matter now. You broke into a condemned building. You trespassed on police property. You resisted arrest. The town is going to be so heartbroken when they hear how the grieving sister finally lost her mind and forced me to shoot her." He placed his finger on the trigger and began to squeeze. Sarah didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She didn't feel the fear anymore. She only felt the overwhelming weight of 21 years of suffering, 21 years of empty holidays, and 21 years of looking at the heavy locks on her front door. She pulled the trigger of the shotgun. The blast in the small, enclosed underground room was absolutely deafening. The sound was a physical force, a shockwave that rattled the dusty wooden shelves and echoed violently off the concrete walls. But Sarah didn't aim for Mark Hayes's chest. She aimed directly at the middle of the rotted, narrow wooden staircase beneath his heavy boots. The heavy buckshot tore through the old wood like paper. The central support beam of the staircase instantly shattered into 1,000 jagged splinters. With a sudden, violent crack, the entire staircase collapsed perfectly under Hayes's massive weight. He let out a sharp cry of shock as the ground simply vanished beneath him. He fell hard, crashing through the broken wood, tumbling violently down the remaining 5 feet into the dark pit. His pistol fired wildly into the ceiling as he hit the dirt floor, the bullet sparking against the steel frame of the trapdoor above. A heavy, sickening crunch echoed in the darkness as Hayes's leg was pinned beneath the heavy, splintered wooden beams. He screamed. It was a raw, agonizing sound of pure pain. The flashlight flew from his hand, rolling into the corner and plunging the room into chaotic, dim shadows. Sarah didn't wait to see if he was dead. She scrambled backward, her ears ringing violently from the gunshot, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her teeth. She kept her eyes locked on the dark pile of broken wood where Hayes was thrashing and cursing in the dirt. She crawled toward the rough concrete wall at the back of the room. She grabbed the dark blue canvas duffel bag, Ellie's bag, containing the bloody shirt and the murder weapon. She slung the heavy strap over her shoulder. Then she grabbed her own flashlight from the ground and rushed toward the collapsed staircase. Hayes was trapped beneath the heavy timber, gripping his broken leg, his face twisted in a mask of fury and pain. He reached desperately toward the dirt, his fingers clawing for his dropped pistol. Sarah stepped firmly on his wrist with her heavy hiking boot. Hayes gasped, looking up at her with eyes full of pure hatred. Sarah looked down at the man who had destroyed her life. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She reached down, grabbed his heavy black service pistol from the dirt, and shoved it deep into her coat pocket. Using the jagged, broken framing of the wall, Sarah pulled herself up the side of the pit, her muscles screaming with the effort. She dragged herself over the edge of the concrete floor and collapsed onto the cold cement of bay number 3. From down in the dark hole, Hayes was screaming her name, threatening to hunt her down, threatening to burn her house to the ground. Sarah ignored him. She stood up, her legs trembling violently, and ran. She ran out the splintered side door of the garage, bursting into the freezing, foggy morning air. The sky to the east was just beginning to turn a pale, bruised purple. The sun was finally rising over Pine Ridge. She threw the duffel bag into the passenger seat of her SUV, climbed behind the wheel, and slammed the doors locked. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely get the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. She slammed the car into drive and hit the gas, tearing out of the abandoned lot and onto the empty highway. She didn't drive toward the local police station. The Pine Ridge Police Department was infected. She didn't know who else was on Hayes's payroll. She didn't know who had helped him run the extraction vans. She merged onto the state interstate and pushed the heavy SUV to 80 miles an hour. She drove for nearly 45 minutes, her eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror, terrified of seeing the flashing blue and red lights of a local cruiser coming up behind her. But the road remained empty. Just after 6 in the morning, Sarah pulled into the massive, well-lit parking lot of the Oregon State Police Headquarters in the neighboring county. The building was a modern fortress of brick and glass, completely disconnected from the small-town politics of Pine Ridge. She killed the engine. For a moment she just sat in the driver's seat, resting her forehead against the cold steering wheel. The adrenaline was finally leaving her body, replaced by a deep, hollow exhaustion. She took a deep breath, grabbed the dark blue duffel bag, and walked through the heavy glass doors of the headquarters. The front desk was manned by a young state trooper sipping a cup of coffee. He looked up, surprised to see a woman covered in mud, her face scratched and bleeding, carrying a heavy military bag. Sarah walked directly to the counter. She placed the duffel bag carefully on the desk. She reached into her coat pocket and placed the black leather notebook on top of the bag. Then, she pulled Chief Hayes's heavy black service pistol from her pocket and set it gently on the counter, sliding it toward the officer. The young trooper instantly stood up, his hand dropping to his own weapon, his eyes wide. "My name is Sarah Vance," Sarah said, her voice completely calm, completely steady. "The chief of police in Pine Ridge murdered my sister 21 years ago. He is currently bleeding in the basement of an abandoned auto shop, trapped beneath a collapsed staircase. Inside this bag is the murder weapon. Inside this notebook is the evidence of a multi-million-dollar federal smuggling operation run by his department." The state trooper stared at her, completely speechless. "I need to speak to the captain," Sarah said, "and you need to send every federal agent you have to Pine Ridge, right now." Within 30 minutes, the quiet morning air of the state headquarters was shattered by absolute chaos. Sarah sat in a small, bright interrogation room wrapped in a gray foil emergency blanket. She drank a cup of hot tea and watched through the window as dozens of state troopers, tactical officers, and FBI agents sprinted to their heavily armored vehicles. The sirens began to wane in the distance, a massive convoy of justice heading straight for the town that had kept a terrible secret for 2 decades. Sarah spent the next 6 hours telling her story. She sat with a lead state detective and a federal agent, walking them through every single detail. She told them about the lockbox buried in the restricted forest. She told them about the surveyor, David Barrett. She told them about the hidden mobile prison in the rusted van. She walked them through Ellie's ledger, line by line, explaining how the stolen vehicles were retrofitted and moved under police escort. The authorities listened in complete silence. They took the bloody mechanic's shirt and the heavy silver wrench to the forensic lab. They logged the styrofoam coffee cup as the most vital piece of connecting evidence in the history of the county. By noon, the lead state detective walked back into the room. He looked at Sarah with a mixture of profound shock and deep respect. "We have him, Sarah," the detective said gently. "State tactical teams breached the garage at 7:30 a.m. Chief Hayes is in custody. He was transported to a secure federal medical facility under heavy guard. We also arrested 3 other veteran officers in the Pine Ridge precinct whose names appeared in your sister's notebook." Sarah closed her eyes, letting out a long, shuddering breath. "And the basement." "We found the basement," the detective confirmed, his voice dropping softly. "And we found the concrete wall." The recovery operation took 3 days. The state police completely cordoned off Miller's auto repair. Thick black tarps were hung over the rusty chain-link fence to keep the news vans and the massive crowds of shocked residents away from the building. The town of Pine Ridge was thrown into an absolute state of disbelief. The chief of police, the man who had led the town's parades, the man who had comforted grieving families, was exposed as a monster. On the third afternoon, the federal forensic team finally brought heavy concrete saws and jackhammers down into the basement. Sarah was allowed to be there. She stood on the concrete floor of Bay Number 3, surrounded by state troopers and federal agents who watched her with silent, protective respect. She listened to the deafening, grinding sound of the saws cutting through the concrete beneath the floor. Every strike of the jackhammer echoed in her chest. Every piece of falling rubble was another lie being torn away. It was agonizing to listen to, but she refused to leave. She had promised Ellie she would be strong. She was not going to abandon her sister in the dark. After 4 hours of meticulous, careful work, the noise finally stopped. A heavy, absolute silence fell over the garage. A few moments later, the lead forensic investigator climbed slowly up the narrow wooden stairs. He walked over to Sarah, took off his hard hat, and offered a single, somber nod. "We found her, Miss Vance," he whispered softly. "She's going home." Sarah fell to her knees on the cold concrete floor. She buried her face in her hands, and for the first time in 21 years she cried without restraint. She cried with a deep, earth-shattering grief that carried the weight of 2 decades of waiting. But underneath the crushing sorrow there was finally peace. The terrible, suffocating anxiety of not knowing was gone. The mystery was over. 10 minutes later, a team of forensic officers slowly carried a metal transport stretcher up from the basement. They did not cover the stretcher with a standard black body bag. Knowing Ellie's history, the state police had requested a heavy, beautifully folded American flag from the local military base. The flag was draped perfectly over the stretcher, covering her remains with the absolute dignity and honor she had always deserved. As the stretcher was carried across the garage floor, every single state trooper, federal agent, and police officer in the room stopped what they were doing. They stood perfectly straight, placed their hands over their hearts, and offered a crisp, silent salute to the fallen soldier. Sarah stood up, her legs shaking, and placed her hand gently on the bright red fabric of the flag. "I got them, Elle," Sarah whispered through her tears. "I got them." The aftermath of the discovery completely shattered the town of Pine Ridge, but it also rebuilt it. The trial of Mark Hayes became a massive national news story. The media descended on the small logging town, documenting the complete dismantling of the corrupt police force. The federal government seized the auto shop, the hidden vans in the forest, and millions of dollars in offshore bank accounts. In the courtroom, Hayes refused to look at Sarah. He sat at the defense table, his leg encased in a heavy cast, staring blankly at the wall. The evidence against him was absolutely overwhelming. The blood on the wrench matched Ellie's DNA. The coffee cup in the duffel bag perfectly matched the lid found in the truck. But the most damning piece of evidence was the notebook. Ellie's meticulous record-keeping destroyed his entire defense. Mark Hayes was found guilty of first-degree murder, federal racketeering, and corruption under the color of law. He was sentenced to life in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole. The other corrupt officers involved in the smuggling ring were given sentences ranging from 20 to 40 years. The Pine Ridge Police Department was temporarily dissolved, its duties taken over by the state police, until a new, clean department could be built from the ground up. The town had to face a difficult, uncomfortable truth. They had to look in the mirror and realize they had taken the easy way out. They had believed the story of the broken, suicidal veteran because it was a simple, common tragedy. They hadn't wanted to look closer. They hadn't wanted to believe that evil could wear a badge and smile at them in the grocery store. But as the truth came to light, the memory of Eleanor Vance changed forever. She was no longer the tragic ghost story of the Blackwood River. She was recognized as a hero. She was a woman who had faced down a heavily armed criminal syndicate entirely alone, armed with nothing but a notebook and an unbreakable sense of justice. She had sacrificed her life to protect her town and to protect her little sister. 6 months after the trial ended, on a bright, clear spring morning, Sarah finally held a funeral for Ellie. It was held at the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the valley. The sky was a brilliant, endless blue, and the air smelled of fresh pine and blooming wildflowers. The entire town of Pine Ridge attended. Thousands of people stood quietly on the grassy hillside. There was a full military honor guard. The sharp, haunting sound of a bugle playing taps echoed across the valley, a beautiful, mournful melody that finally laid the past to rest. Sarah stood at the front of the crowd, wearing a dark coat, holding the heavy, folded American flag tightly to her chest. She watched as her sister was finally laid to rest in the bright sunlight, completely free from the darkness of the basement. After the ceremony, the crowd slowly dispersed, returning to their quiet, ordinary lives. Sarah stayed behind. She stood alone by the beautiful granite headstone. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small, faded silver dog tag that David Barrett had found buried in the woods. She gently placed the metal tag on top of the polished stone. She smiled, a small, genuine smile that finally reached her eyes. She didn't feel the need to look over her shoulder anymore. She didn't feel the need to check the locks on her doors 3 times a night. The heavy armor she had worn for 21 years finally fell away. Sarah turned and walked slowly down the hill toward her car, leaving the quiet cemetery behind. The truth is a strange and powerful thing. People often believe that time can bury the truth. They believe that if you pour enough concrete, if you tell a lie enough times, the world will simply forget what really happened. But the truth does not die in the dark. It just waits. It waits for a single mistake. It waits for the rain to wash away the mud. It waits for someone who refuses to stop looking. Eleanor Vance vanished into the darkness of a cold October night, but the light she left behind was strong enough to guide her sister home.